the unthinkable is happening on the front lines. Vladimir Putin's massive 2026 spring offensive hasn't just stalled, it is shattering against the legendary Donetsk fortress belt. What was supposed to be a glorious Russian breakthrough has transformed into a catastrophic death trap swallowing elite units whole. As the smoke clears over the H-20 highway, experts are asking, is this the definitive end of Russia's military ambitions? Putin never saw this level of resistance coming yet. Right now. Military experts from the Institute for the Study of War are openly predicting the total and humiliating failure of Russia's entire 2026 campaign plans. Those plans were brutally straightforward: seize the fortress belt in 2026 at all costs. Russia's spring offensive was built entirely around the collapse of this defensive stronghold, and France 24 has laid it out clearly. This string of heavily fortified cities and settlements forms the absolute key to capturing the Donetsk region, which in turn would supposedly trigger the fall of the entire Donbass, the very prize Putin has demanded Ukraine surrender since peace talks even began. What Putin has always tried to sell to the West and to his own people is that the fortress belt is weak, that Ukraine is on the brink of total collapse, and that once this line falls, Russia would control what former U.S. Navy Vice Admiral Robert B. Murrett called a veritable highway straight into the heart of Ukraine and beyond. The prize seemed worth the brutal squeeze, at least in Moscow's twisted calculations. Ukraine holds fortress. In the smoke-choked fields and shattered tree lines of eastern Ukraine, the brutal reality of Vladimir Putin's collapsing spring offensive slams home with devastating force as the mighty Donetsk fortress belt stands unbreakable, turning Russia's desperate push into a graveyard of shattered ambitions and mounting Russian corpses. This is no ordinary defensive line. It stretches as a formidable chain of 4 major cities and countless smaller settlements running north to south along the critical H-20 Kostian-Tinivka-Sloviansk highway, spanning roughly 50 kilometers of layered defenses that were home to more than 380,000 people before the full-scale invasion, creating a raw and terrifying scale that Russian commanders were ordered to crush entirely by the end of 2026. The spring offensive was meant to mark the glorious beginning of Russia's long-awaited breakthrough, with Putin personally demanding a lightning victory that would shatter Ukrainian resistance once and for all. Yet the fortress belt has been a thorn in his side long before the 2022 invasion even started, a living symbol of Ukrainian defiance forged in fire. Since the fighting erupted back in 2014, which led to the illegal annexation of Crimea and chaos across the Donbass, Ukraine has poured more than a decade into transforming this zone into an impregnable fortress of reinforced concrete bunkers. Endless networks of trenches, dense minefields, overlapping kill zones bristling with anti-tank guided missiles, and sophisticated drone surveillance towers that give defenders eyes on every approach. Over 10 years of relentless fortification has meant 10 years of Russia failing to make any meaningful dent, no matter how many lives Moscow throws at it in wave after suicidal wave of human assaults. You can almost hear the thunder of Ukrainian artillery ripping through the dawn as Russian columns advance only to be shredded by pre-sighted fire. FPV drone strikes, dropping grenades with pinpoint accuracy and machine gun nests that turn open fields into killing corridors. Russia desperately needs this belt to fall because it would hand Putin the last 30% of Donetsk still outside his grasp and let him try to spin the obvious disaster of his so-called special military operation into some kind of twisted success story for domestic consumption, yet nobody outside Russia would believe it. And that has never stopped the Kremlin from doubling down on delusion. Putin has his spring plan locked in and refuses to adapt, even though his forces have already spent more than 20 months grinding for tiny gains just to reach the outskirts of Chasiv Yar, a small settlement beyond the main belt, somehow convincing himself that this grinding failure on the edges could translate into the total destruction of far stronger defenses deeper inside the fortress belt. All he thought he needed was more manpower, and he has delivered it in horrifying waves of human waves, sending young Russian soldiers straight into prepared Ukrainian crosshairs. Yet already the cracks are turning into a full-scale breakdown that has military analysts worldwide watching in stunned disbelief. The 2026 spring offensive has gotten off to a catastrophic start, with casualties exploding even before Russian units get anywhere near the main defensive lines. Just days into the operation, Russian losses were already approaching 10,000 soldiers killed or wounded, according to the national interest, and the campaign is breaking grim records in the worst possible way. On March 27th alone, Russia lost 1,710 troops in a single 24-hour period, the highest daily toll recorded so far. In 2026, a bloodbath of epic proportions, where Ukrainian defenders unleashed coordinated barrages of HIMARS rockets, precision artillery, and swarms of attack drones that turned Russian assault groups into burning wreckage across the open terrain. Military analysts warn that far worse is still coming, because Putin's strategy has not evolved beyond the barbaric tactic of hurling endless cannon fodder straight into Ukraine's prepared killing fields, creating scenes of pure carnage that feel ripped from the worst nightmares of modern warfare. These early losses were already screaming that the offensive was doomed, with the goal of collapsing the fortress belt, suddenly looking impossibly distant as Ukrainian forces methodically picked apart every Russian advance with superior technology and unbreakable resolve. Is this the moment Putin's war machine finally breaks? With 1,710 elite troops lost in a single day, the Donetsk fortress belt isn't just holding, it's systematically dismantling the Kremlin's last hope for a 2026 victory. Are we witnessing the definitive collapse of the Russian spring offensive? When even the Kremlin's most loyal propagandists start calling for Putin's resignation, the front line is in chaos. As Ukraine's invisible drone tech turns the H-20 highway into a Russian graveyard, one question remains. Has Putin's ego finally outrun his army's ability to survive? Russia is now doing the only thing it knows, pouring even more manpower into the meat grinder in the desperate hope that quantity will finally overcome quality. Mashovets revealed in his March 29th analysis that Moscow has already begun pulling soldiers from its so-called mobilization reserve in the occupied parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. These were troops originally meant to stay back as reinforcements once breakthroughs occurred, but they are now being rushed straight into the front lines alongside volunteer assault corps. In plain terms, Russia is burning through reserves far faster than planned, because losses are skyrocketing while territorial gains remain almost non-existent. The failed pincer attempt has left Putin facing an impossible dilemma. He can keep relying on the weak and bloodied southern forces that have achieved nothing, or he can shift troops from the slightly less unsuccessful northern sector, which would immediately expose those hard-won positions to devastating Ukrainian counterattacks. Either choice feeds the fortress belt's deadly appetite, turning Russian soldiers into targets in a trap that has already driven daily casualties to record heights during the opening weeks of the spring offensive. The fortress belt is doing exactly what it was engineered to do: shut down Russia's entire offensive cold. The few small advances Moscow managed earlier could theoretically support operations toward Lyman and Kostiantynivka, but they fall far short of what is needed to drive all the way to Sloviansk. Putin is forced to choose between two failing fronts, and in both cases, he is sentencing his troops to slaughter inside a defensive system that has stood unbreached since 2014. This is the brutal reality the Kremlin never wanted to admit. The spring offensive is already imploding, and if Putin had been paying attention, he would have seen this disaster coming months ago. Before we dive deeper into the even darker twist, making this nightmare worse for the Russian leader, let me pause for a moment and ask you something important. With Ukraine's fortress belt holding firm and Russian casualties exploding, do you believe Kiev's defenders can maintain this unbreakable stand through the rest of 2026 and turn the tide with fresh counteroffensives, or will Putin eventually find a way to grind through sheer numbers despite the horrific cost? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now, because this is the kind of high-stakes question that defines the future of the entire Donbas front. What we are witnessing now was predicted with chilling accuracy long before the spring guns even opened fire. Back on December 18th, two Russia researchers from the Institute for the Study of War, Jenny Olmsted and Jessica Sobieski, issued a stark warning while Russia was still locked in a 22-month struggle just to capture Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. They stated plainly that Russian forces were unlikely to seize the full Donetsk region and the fortress belt any sooner than 2027 or 2028, provided Ukraine continued receiving strong international support. Everything unfolding in these opening weeks of the spring offensive is proving that forecast devastatingly correct. This is not entirely Putin's personal failure, though his tactical blindness and that of his top commanders have made everything far worse. Russia spent the closing months of 2025 trying to set the stage for victory by pushing in Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, while carving out a buffer zone in southern Ukraine to block reserves from reinforcing the fortress belt. For a brief time, it looked like the plan might work until Ukraine launched a lightning counteroffensive at the end of January that liberated 400 square kilometers of territory, shattering Moscow's southern buffer and forcing Russia to divert elite units and paratroopers away from the main effort just to stop the bleeding. That left the fortress belt assault force stripped down to undertrained cannon fodder soldiers, rushed into battle with minimal preparation and facing defenses they were never equipped to overcome. The result has been predictable carnage. Ukraine's technological superiority, especially its expanding fleet of mid-range drones, is now striking deep into Russian rear areas across occupied Donbas, systematically destroying air defense systems and key command nodes, while Russian troops bleed out in frontal assaults. This is the ugly truth behind the record daily casualties that keep climbing higher with each passing week. As Putin watches his fortress belt plans crumble, the bigger crisis is erupting inside Russia itself. Influential military bloggers who once served as the Kremlin's most loyal propaganda voices are now turning against him in public, and the shift is sending shockwaves through Moscow's information machine. Yuri Podolyaka, a former Ukrainian who switched sides in 2014 and built a massive audience of 2.7 million YouTube subscribers and 2.8 million Telegram followers, has delivered a devastating assessment of the offensive so far. He openly admitted that the advantage is slowly shifting to Ukraine's side, because highly qualified specialists are exploiting their technical superiority with ruthless efficiency. Podolyaka went further, declaring that in the coming months, Russia simply will not be able to reverse the situation no matter how hard it tries, warning of massive losses ahead as Ukraine's mid-range drones tear apart Russian rear positions and air defenses. These are the words of a man who spent years beating the drum for inevitable Ukrainian collapse, now telling millions that the spring offensive is heading for disaster. He is not alone. Ilya Remeslo, another longtime advocate of Russian dominance, has turned even more sharply, calling the entire invasion a dead-end war that could drag on for another decade simply to satisfy one man's ego. Remeslo has gone so far as to declare that Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate president and must resign to face trial as a war criminal and thief. These voices, once the backbone of Kremlin disinformation, are now broadcasting to millions that Russia is failing and that Putin's leadership is dragging the country into catastrophe. This internal revolt is the real long-term threat to the Russian leader, and it is being fueled every single day by the fortress belt's continued defiance and the mounting body count of young Russian soldiers sacrificed for zero gains. The fortress belt will keep doing what it has done since 2014, standing as an unbreakable shield against aggression, while the Kremlin's timeline of months stretches into years and the human cost spirals out of control. Russia's deadliest day of 2026 has already been recorded, yet every indicator suggests the worst is still ahead, as the